Hello good guys and welcome to another video. Today we are doing a what if the continents all went to war. It's kind of like a battle royale. There will be somewhat teams, but it is going to be a battle royale. Every continent versus every continent, seeing which one is the last one alive. So here in yellow we have Europe, in purple we have Asia, in this kind of pinkish color we have Africa, blue is South America, orange is North America, and in light green we have Oceania, or if you call it that, Australia. Now for Oceania, we also have all of these islands included, which if you know your geography, you know this isn't actually Oceania, this is Asia. But if you take a look at the map, Asia is probably the strongest and Oceania is probably the weakest. So it's a good way of kind of balancing things out to give Oceania a bit more land. That way they don't get instantly destroyed and Asia doesn't have as much power as they would. So after mentioning that, let's go ahead and begin. So first things first, over here in North America, we see U.S. and Mexican troops begin to push down into Panama and Colombia, taking a decent portion of the coast. Meanwhile, South America pushes up some of these islands up to Puerto Rico until the North American Navy stops them. Over here in Africa, we have European troops making a landing in Morocco and beginning to push across the coast until they are eventually stopped by Algerian troops. Over here, we also have Asian troops begin to push into Africa, taking a decent portion of Egypt until eventually being stopped again by African troops. And along the border, Asia takes the island of Cyprus, along with pushing up into the Caucasus Mountain region, while Europe begins a massive push into Asia, taking a lot of the old Russian lands. May look like a lot, but trust me, this is not very important. And in the end, Asia's probably going to take this back without losing too much. Down here in Oceania, we have absolutely nothing happened. The Oceanic Navy is right there, and so is the Asian, and nobody's making any moves on anybody. They're just standing there trying to protect themselves. Meanwhile, over here in North America, we finally see the North American Navy arriving, kicking South America off, and basically just pushing their navy down to about there, which allows them to begin to push down into South America, taking a lot of northern Colombia. And why is that like that? Oh, wrong color there. Let's fix that quickly. There we go. And as I said, the U.S. is pushing down more and more into Colombia, taking this entire bay. I forgot what it's called, but between Venezuela and Colombia. They also begin to push down the coast of Colombia and basically just take a majority of northern, like South America. Although Brazilian and Peruvian troops are pretty quick actually to stop them. Europe decides that it needs some more resources, so guess where they go? Africa. They begin to push across the Algerian coastline, dedicating a lot of resources to try and take these lands for themselves, thinking that it can give them the power boost they'll need against Asia. Meanwhile, Asia's basically just doing the same thing, thinking, hey, let's all go after Africa, we'll split the land, and that'll help us win against Europe. So Asia begins to push down the Egyptian coast, and at this point I think Europe's gaining more land, but Asia has a considerable amount of coastline here as well. Meanwhile, we do see Asia doing something, and that's an island landing on the island of Sumatra. It goes alright for them, but honestly, Asia didn't really dedicate a lot of troops. Australia pushes back. They actually managed to make a landing in Asia, believe it or not. And they push up the Malay Peninsula until they meet up with Vietnamese and Indian forces to stop them. That was very surprising, but it happened. And we now see Europe basically just pushing in a ton more into these Russian lands. Isn't very protected, it's mostly just wasteland, but Europe needs the oil, Europe needs the resources to supply their economy. And Asia really doesn't need it, as they have land in China and India, which gives them more than enough resources. but they would rather push up into the Caucasus region and begin to plan a naval landing to take Istanbul, although it's heavily protected and the European Navy is holding them off pretty well. We see Asia and Europe continue their rampage in Africa, with Asia pushing across into Egypt a lot more, taking a lot of land off of the Persian Gulf. Basically just, majority of the Persian Gulf. Nope, I'm an idiot. That's the Persian Gulf. This is the Red Sea. A majority of the Red Sea is what I meant to say. Meanwhile, Europe begins to push more and more down the coast of Africa, taking a lot of major cities, a lot of population, and quite a decent amount of resources as well, with African armies not being able to stop them. Although eventually, we do actually see African armies arrive and begin to push back the Europeans. So Africa just pushed back Europe, believe it or not. They also begin to push back Asia, but that goes a lot worse as Asia's defense was a lot better. Down here in the south, we do finally see Asia actually send some troops to deal with Oceania, and they begin to push back. And as much as Australian and Indonesian forces try to hold off, they have nothing against superior Indian and Vietnamese forces. Along with, I believe I'm saying this, but Indian and Pakistani forces that work together to kick off Oceania. Sounds so wrong. Meanwhile, Asia makes their landing in Istanbul, which goes okay for them. They take quite a bit of land. But as I said, this is a very important part of Europe, so Asia's eventually pushed back. And even Europe manages to make a landing in Turkey. Now, you may be thinking that I'm underestimating Asia. Maybe I'm overestimating Europe, underestimating Africa. But whatever you think, Asia is now pushing back. So, see, now everybody's happy. We also see Asia continue their push up here. It isn't really the Caucasus region anymore. It's more of like a southern Russian region. And they take a lot of land there, which is pretty bad for the Europeans. So they finally send in some forces to push back a bit. But overall, they decide to keep going for the resource-rich other half of Siberian Russia. This won't hold for long as Asia's finally starting to notice that Europe's actually doing something up here that's pretty important. But for now, Europe does control all of that nice, sweet, sweet land. And just to make it hurt even more, North America makes a landing in Northern Asia, taking a decent amount of land before eventually pulling away. They managed to take the entirety of the Kimchi Peninsula and a bit of coastal access to the Sea of Okhotsk, with a plan to meet up with Europe and take over Asia. With this, we see some European and Asian forces retreating out of Africa, as Europe and Asia are now just fighting amongst each other, and they see Africa as less important than their own homeland. So we see Africa pushing back the Europeans pretty well. They don't kick them off completely, but they push back a lot. Same thing with the Asians, push up the Red Sea, taking a ton of land back from Asia. Meanwhile, North America is continuing their push into South America, taking more land out of Colombia, down the coast of Venezuela, and make a landing from Trinidad into... No, that's not Trinidad and Tobago. Maybe it is. No, it's not. That's a random island. Down from their, island chains and into the Guyana area, I guess you could call it. They also begin to push down Ecuador. If you didn't know, right here, all along here, mountains. So they're going to try and stay to the west of those mountains to take the coast, which they do so pretty successfully. And we now see North America controlling a good part of South America, which they decide to expand upon to basically just get a better grip of South America. As the sooner they take over that, the sooner they can dedicate their forces to Asia. Over here in Africa, just one big stalemate, no sides making progress. In Oceania, we see oceanic forces pile up here, getting ready to attack Asia, We also see North America sending a lot of forces to the border, and Europe sending a lot of forces to the border. We also see Africa even join in on this, as Europe and Africa made kind of an agreement where Europe retreats out of Africa completely, and they gain African help in taking over Asia, basically. We then see all army troops, except for South America, who's protecting from the north, being put on the Asian border, and the attack begins. First things first, we see African troops push into Egypt, taking back the entire land. They also push into the Asian part of Egypt, taking the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. We see the Europeans making their own advances into Turkey. They push back down into the Caucasus, retaking the entire region, and down into the Middle East, a decent amount. They also retake the island of Cyprus. I should probably mention that. Next thing we see North American forces doing is pushing down to try and capture the entirety of the Sea of Okhotsk. This goes pretty well for them until they eventually meet Japanese resistance, which stops them from taking the entire thing. Although they do have major control over the region. We also see European troops begin an attack on the Caspian to cut off Asia from the region. They push across the coast and manage to take the entire, area. They also begin to push across, meeting up with North American forces, who hold kind of a ceasefire for now, but that won't last very long, as I said before, this is a free-for-all. We then see Europe and Africa deciding to split the Middle East, with Europe gaining a good amount of land from it. And so does Africa, which is probably pretty soon going to lead to a new Europe-African war, but for now, they're at peace. For now. We then see this massive Asian attack almost ending, as the last attacker of Oceania begins to push up to retake this Malay Peninsula, the Malaysian Peninsula, if you'd like it. They push up and capture the entire thing, taking a pretty good amount of Southeast Asia. With this, they begin to push down the coast of Southeast Asia, and they did pretty well for themselves there, considering they're up against Asia. But now that this is over with, we see multiple wars getting reinstated as South America begins to push back the north after North American troops were redispatched to Asia to try and take over, as I said, that the Sea of Okhotsk. European troops are also not much in the Middle East, as they thought Africa could hold the border. But little did they know that Africa is tired of European colonialism and decide to turn on them and begin to take their Middle Eastern land. They push in a good amount before European troops eventually arrive, as they were already guarding some oil fields in Iran and Kuwait. And Africa doesn't get very far, as we now see Europe and Asia actually making a deal in which Europe gives back a good amount of Asia's land here in the Middle East in return for their help against Africa. With this, Europe and Asia split the Middle East away from Africa, taking the region for themselves. And now Europe and Asia have a larger front, which may not move for a few days, but that's going to be a whole mess pretty soon. So next things next, Europe wants revenge against Africa for betraying them. So they begin to push in from Asia's border. And they begin to push in, making landings from Spain, making landings from Italy, making landings from Greece. Basically just trying to take the entirety of North Africa as a bit of revenge. Even Asia gets in on that, which despite being weakened, they see an even weaker Africa and begin to take a ton of land from Somalia and Ethiopia, until eventually a lot of Africa is split between the Asian and European powers. Asia takes a lot of the Horn of Africa, Meanwhile, Europe takes a majority of the north and a lot of the coastline. With this, Africa's been weakened and they decide to just try and hold a front to not lose any more land. Meanwhile, now North America's finally sending more troops back into South America, who pushed down both coastlines, taking quite a good amount of land actually, and South America is finally beginning to fall. But that doesn't happen before African troops actually, once again, believe it or not, managed to make a landing here in Brazil. And with this, we see this, well, no, not yet. First things first, we see South America instantly pushing back the Africans, as that was kind of Africa's last chance, and now they're dying. Meanwhile, North America basically just says, we need to push across the mountains somewhere. Let's do it down here in the south. They managed to, push across the Andes and basically just create two spearheads to try and cut off the entirety of the Amazon, in which they could get the region to surrender to them. Not really have full control, but in theory, full control. Now, for now, it looks ugly, but we see the region actually falling to them, as they had hoped. And North America begins to push down into South America even more, taking a majority of the continent. Eventually, the only real powers left are half of Chile, half of Brazil, and Argentina. The U.S.'s first goal is to capitulate Chile, which they do pretty quickly. Then they attempt to capitulate the Brazilian state. Once again, not very difficult, just take the coast. And now it's basically just Argentina left. But to solidify that, the U.S. begins another spearhead to cut off all of central Brazil from Argentina. They take the region, and at this point, South America knows it's dead and just decides to surrender to the north. During this actually, North America didn't have very many troops in Asia, allowing them to push back with mostly Japanese and South Korean. And I can't believe I'm saying this, South Korea working with North Korea to push out the Americans, which goes pretty successfully. And as this is a battle royale, the Europeans also push in despite their previous, agreement not to. Why is that not working? I'm not sure. But they do take a good part of the land, with Asia taking the rest. With this, though, European troops are spread very, very thin, with not enough troops to go around, and Asia attempts to retake the Middle East, gaining control of the Caspian Sea, and pushing back in Central Asia. At this point, all sides are getting tired, but this war is not over yet, so one more party comes into Africa to attempt to capitulate the continent, and that is North American troops down here. With this, there's basically just a split of Africa. I don't want to go into detail on how it happened because it's not very pretty, but in the end, the continent is split between the three major powers of this world. There we go. Well, now that Europe, North America, and Asia have taken over Africa, it's everyone against Asia again. We see Oceania continue their push into Southeast Asia, not gaining too much land, but hey, they'll take what they can get. They'll take anything that they can get, actually. With them actually being surprised that Asia hasn't killed them yet, although they might kill them soon, seeing as they're making advances pretty quickly. But I think Asia has other problems with this split of their African territories between North America and Europe, with North America getting a majority, but Europe does get its fair share as well. With this, we see North America making another landing, taking basically just the Korean Peninsula and Japan. And this is kind of sped up because this video is getting too long, but Asia begins to capitulate until eventually some rebel groups form up, as it's Asia. Why wouldn't there be rebel groups? We see India join the Europeans, basically, with the region rising up. Pakistan and Afghanistan fall completely. Southeast Asia is basically just like handed over to Oceania. Don't really have to even fight for it. Europe continues to take land, and the complete split up of Asia happens, with Europe getting a lot of the central bits, North America and Oceania splitting the rest. Like that. So now we have our last three countries in this world. You may have thought that Asia was going to win, but seeing as they're caught in the middle of Africa, they're right next to Europe and Oceania, and a small boat ride away from North America. They're kind of stuck in the middle of everything and couldn't have survived long. For the next thing to happen, it's the complete obliteration of Oceania. I'm surprised they even made it this far. Like, honestly, just congratulations, Oceania, on somehow snagging third place. But we all know you're not going to win this, so just die already. We see the complete and total capitulation of Oceania to North American troops. Who would have seen that coming? Now we have our final two countries of North America and Europe, but while North America was pushing into Oceania, we did see some European pushback, taking a majority, all of Africa back, and that's basically just about it. We then see the two continents being put at kind of a stalemate, but that is broken when Europe begins to push into these northern Canadian islands. Looks useless, but guess who's invading them? Oh, it's Finland, Sweden, and Norway. It all makes sense now, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Well, that's just great, because now you've pissed off North America, who is now attempting to push back. Oh my god, those borders are going to look horrible by the end of this. Into the northern islands of Canada, taking a majority of them. And at this point, both sides are kind of just tired of fighting, and there's probably going to be a ceasefire made soon. I'm so sorry about the barking. Not really too much I can do about that, but we are going to be speeding this up, seeing as we already know who's going to win. When it comes to North America versus Europe, Europe is stronger. They took over South America, they took over Africa, they took over East Asia, and they took over the rest of Asia. I think we all know who's going to win this, so let's get it going with this. Bang, bop, bang. Boom. All of these islands going to Europe, with them basically just joining them. They'd rather be a part of Europe than North America. And all of Asia falls to Europe, which basically now just means that Europe has won. As with all of Asia and everything else, it's a stalemate. But in the end, I do say that Europe is going to win this. Eventually, they'll make landings, they'll win. Do hope you guys have enjoyed, and goodbye.